copy this morning. What if China rules the world? Beijing's power, both economic and political, continue to grow, and it may only be a matter before it takes over the globe. Our next guest, Martin Jacques, actually wrote the book, When China Rules the World. He first published this in 2009. This is already the second edition. We had him on Headstart. That was in 2012. And the question now is, was he actually the prophet during that time for what Asia and the whole world is experiencing today? Back in the Philippines is Martin Jacques. Thank you so much for coming to Headstart. Welcome back.
Great pleasure. I remember the last interview with great affection.
All right, 2012 you were here, and this continues to be a best-selling book globally. It's been translated to 15 to 17 languages, am I correct?
Correct.
And the timing, this book is more relevant than ever before.
Sure.
My first question is, why is it when China rules the world? Why not if China rules the world? You have critics already saying, wasn't Martin assuming too much in writing when China rules the world?
Well, I think if you look at events since 2009, basically they've confirmed the argument, and my argument was not literally China ruling the world, because no country ever has and no country ever will. China won't rule the world. What I was arguing was that China will become the most important and influential country in the world, and that is clearly happening.
Okay. In the Philippine context, in the interest of the Philippines, what do you make of our relationship with China today, considering when you were here in 2012, you first said the thing about the Philippines is you knew more about the US than your own neighbor, which turns out to be true. But then today, 6 years after, since you've returned, how has it changed?
Well, I think that the big problem that the Philippines had when I was here in 2012 was that it was sort of displaced out of its neighborhood. It was, of course, for reasons we understand, very influenced by the United States, looking always to the United States. And around it, all its neighbors were more and more trading with and looking to China. So the Philippines was out of touch with what was happening in the region and was pursuing a course, I think, which was not good at all for the Philippines, because a country must look to the future, not get stuck in its past. So Philippines was looking in the rearview mirror, not looking through the front windscreen about where it was going. And since then, I mean, I think that there's been a very, very big shift in the Philippines under President Duterte, which he recognized that the Philippines needed to open up to China in all sorts of different ways, but first of all economically, in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of various forms of cooperation, and that is exactly what's happened. And so I think this is a really important period of modern Filipino history, that it is changing its coordinates. It is becoming part of the region. It's becoming part of the trend of the region, and it's now relating to China in a very important and positive way.
Well, one thing that's unique about you is, one, you're British, you're from the West, and yet you know more about China than many Asians do. You're an expert on it. You've studied their history. You know essentially where they're coming from. Why does a big part of the world, honestly, fear China? Even Filipinos, if you look at surveys, there's a distrust when it comes to China and more trust with the US. What aren't we understanding about China?
Well, I don't think this is in the least bit surprising, because for 200 years, from the late 18th century, China was invisible. No one knew anything about it because it went into decline, relative decline, or even in some senses absolute decline. It was very poor, it was very divided, it was invaded by European powers and so on. So until 1949, China was not there. It was a big blank in the consciousness of the world, in the Western world, but also across the world. So people were very ignorant about China. And the other problem was that during the Cold War, you know, a lot of the mentality of the Cold War was China is evil and all this kind of thing, you know. So a combination of ignorance and fear promoted this kind of China worries me. And I think this is based overwhelmingly on a misconception about China. I mean, we need to understand China. China's a great civilization, extraordinary history, it's the home of statecraft, very sophisticated government, a very interesting culture, and it's very, very rich. In many ways, much richer than the West, which is a relatively recent creation. So I think that China is, in a way, a treasure trove to discover. And, it's got good things and it's got bad things. What will it be like for the future? I think, sure, there are negative things about China, but there are many positive things. And if you live in this region, especially in this region, but now we can see also to the world, we need to find the way to relate to China. And this will be very rewarding for us. But we have to push back our extraordinary levels of ignorance and engage with it and be curious about it.
Okay, first you said that there's a misconception about China. You may have professors in the Philippines who will argue with you based on the West Philippine Sea dispute and how China has behaved. One, they did not participate in the arbitral tribunal ruling case, the case in itself. They refused to participate. Until today, even after the victory of the Philippines, China is still holding to their belief that they own, that it's their territory until the 9-dash line, which is quite controversial because a decision's already been made. First of all, what do you make of China's behavior even after the International Tribunal ruling on the West Philippine Sea dispute? Well,
China doesn't accept the legal basis of it. And here you come against a very interesting problem, which is for that legislation, basically history starts. Well, when does that history start for Western countries and also for many other countries as well? It starts with the West, the rise of the West. Okay, so it's 200 years, or in this specific case, probably more since the Second World War. For China and their view of the South China Sea, it goes back thousands of years. So China's going to change the way, actually, one way or another, that we understand history and how we even date history. And so that's the first thing. So China doesn't recognize the legislation, which was the law, which was the basis for the decision and the basis for the tribunal. So it never participated in it. It never submitted any evidence in relationship to it. Its claim is, well, it's a little bit ambiguous, actually, China is. Its claim, is it over the whole of the South China Sea or just the land features of the South China Sea? I think there's an ambiguity in the Chinese position. Now, in reality, China will never, ever be able to once more resume any sort of control of these islands because there are Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, the 5 or 6 countries who already have occupied lots of these islands. So the Chinese are not going to try and take back those islands.
No, but you already have China reclaiming many islands within the Philippine territory, the exclusive economic zone. Yeah. So I'll ask you first this. Based on your study, was it right first for the Philippines to file a case to sue China? Was that the right way to go?
No, it was a big mistake. I mean, I was very, very sceptical about it under Aquino. He was much too close to the United States. And I did actually feel that at the heart of this claim was a very close and unfortunate collaboration between the United States and the Philippines in relationship to it. I think it was a mistake because in the long run you've got to have an understanding with China. So if you fly in the face of China, you use a body which the Chinese are not going to accept and so on, that's not the way you're going to get anywhere with China. And the Duterte's approach, in my view, is much wiser, which is to understand that actually the future of the Philippines, the central relationship will more and more become the relationship with China. So an understanding needs to be reached with China. And there will be an understanding, and I will predict that the basis of the understanding is going to be the Chinese are never going to concede sovereignty, their claim of sovereignty. But they do want to cooperate and collaborate. So what's going to happen in all these island cases is they'll stay more or less as they are. the sovereignty question will be in effect shelved, and there will be joint development, which is already happening, by the way, in one case in the West Philippine Sea. And that's the way things are going to move, not just for the Philippines, but for the other claimants as well. So that's how I see the future in relationship to the South China Sea. There'll be no, I don't imagine any wars and that kind of thing. I think that's the way it will proceed. And it won't seem so odd in the context of Belt and Road. Because if you look at Belt and Road, which is basically a series of bilateral and multilateral deals with lots of countries, with China, for example, in all the lots of new deals that are being made with the Philippines, China is a player and the Philippines is a player in that relationship. In other words, it's happening on Philippine territory or happening on Malaysian territory or whatever it is, but it's a joint development. And so the idea of shared development will become intrinsic to the future of this region. And the Chinese are not going to be, I think, expansionist in the sense of claims over sovereignty and all that kind of thing. They're just going to let, in a way, sleeping dogs lie.
But then, speaking of expansionist China, you've also said in your talks, well, number one, you do have China as the largest exporter. It is the second largest importer. As of now, there are 140 million Chinese tourists all over the world, give or take. You also have China investing in developing nations. China's very present in continent like Africa, for example. In the Philippines, you have a lot of bilateral deals with China. Compared to other superpowers, would you say China has performed the way other superpowers have? Like, for example, the UK, the US, or even Japan, wherein there's some kind of integrity. The deals can be trusted. The record of China doesn't seem very good.
Well, if I can be so bold as to disagree with you, I think that China's record in relationship to the developing world is totally different from the Western powers. I mean, what did Britain and France and Germany and so on do? They colonized as many places as possible. China's not colonizing anyway. It's actually got no history of colonialism. The Chinese history is very different. I think it'll be a very different kind of great power, point one. Point two, China is a developing country, although parts of it have moved beyond that status on the coastal region and so on, but it's a developing country. What does that mean? It understands developing countries. It has an affinity for developing countries, which, for example, the United States does not have. The United States does not understand how a developing country really can move from where it is now to where it would like to be with a much more developed status. So the whole approach of the Chinese has been to find the ways to enable them to develop. This is very important. The most important strategic relationship China has in the world, even more important looking forward than the relationship with China and the United States, is with the developing countries. China, what is the most important offer China makes to the world now, especially the developing world? Development. And this is absolutely at the heart of the Chinese approach. And, of course, in the West you get lots of criticism of China. Americans, for a long time, just ignored Belt and Road and said it doesn't matter. Now it can't stop criticizing it because it's making a lot of headway. And what's their criticism? They say debt trap. There's no evidence for most of their arguments. I mean, I'm not saying the Chinese haven't made mistakes, but that's a completely different matter.
So what you're saying, the debt trap, is technically, it's bad PR. It's essentially to make China look bad, but there's no proof of that. What about articles on Sri Lanka, for example?
Well, I mean, Sri Lanka is the only case where an item of property, which is the port in question, was actually the Chinese have a 99-year lease on it because they got into bad debt and so on. Although Sri Lanka's debts are mainly not with China, by the way. Their debts are mainly with other countries, not with China. But that is the only example of this. There are no other examples. I mean, there's a report recently by the Rhodium Commission, or whatever it's called, on it, and said there's absolutely no evidence for this debt trap argument.
Now, since you've written the book, you're the only one who's the expert so far. Well, there's also another speaker. I saw him recently. But then, You speak about essentially China being a different kind of superpower in your book, right? You describe it as a civilization state and not a nation state. You describe China as unity is paramount for China, that China wants order, stability, and unity. It's the priority of China as a nation. What kind of superpower will China be compared to, let's say, the US or other countries in the West? What will make it different?
Well, in a nutshell, I think that the two modes of expansion of Western powers, like Britain, like France, like the United States, was one, military, and two, political. They had made no compunctions about, well, obviously with colonization, with taking countries over, and in the American era, regime change has been so fundamental to the way the Americans have addressed the world. So one, military, two, political. What will the sources of Chinese influence be? Modes of expansion. One, economic. It's going to be a giant.
Okay.
It's going to be a giant. I mean, the projection is that something like by 2030, 2035, the Chinese economy will be twice the size of the American economy. I mean, it's going to be enormous.
And is it just a factor of population, or it's more than that?
It's part, you know, for initially in the early phases, definitely demographic. But we've seen the speed with which China has transformed itself. And if you go to cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai and so on, you can see they're as modern as Western cities now. And so, and they become very innovative. You know, Tencent, Alibaba, Huawei are now really fierce competitors of Silicon Valley. Who would have thought that could have happened in such a short space of time? So I think that China's going to be economically, it is and will be very economically dynamic and very influential. So that's one, okay, economic. Secondly, I think China's other mode of influence will be cultural.
Really?
Yeah. Now,
cultural?
You see, people think, soft power? China hasn't got much soft power, you know. No.
I mean, you're seeing Korea have soft power today.
Yeah.
Korea.
But we mustn't think of soft power as, you know, basically a branch of popular music. And I think the problem with a lot of the way we think about it, or did you do well in the last Olympic Games, or did you win the World Cup at football, or you know, have you hit the fashion, that kind of thing.
So what kind of soft power are you seeing coming from China?
It is much deeper than that. It is about the way that China sees the world and thinks about it. You know, Chinese culture is very sophisticated. And so take governance, for example. Now, at the moment, the tendency in the West is to dismiss Chinese governance because it's all about whether or not you've got multi-party system and universal suffrage. But can your government deliver? You know, is it just? You can't discuss governance just as a mode of election. Maybe elected governments are pretty useless often.
But then, Martin, you may have someone argue with you because Hong Kong, which is a territory in itself, refuses they refuse to accept the extradition bill with China, and that says a lot already. These are already residents that know China essentially, and you look at the violence in the protests in the last few days. So how can one say that there's soft power there? China seems to be failing in that regard with its own territory.
Well, I think that's a very fair point in my view. I think that, yes, look, the problem that the Chinese face with Hong Kong is that really it's a Western-style society with Western-style assumptions. It was a British colony for 156 years. You're not a colony for 156 years without that having profound effects. So there is a mismatch there, and the Chinese, and so there's a lot of suspicion actually in Hong. I mean, I lived in Hong Kong for 3 years. And there's a lot of suspicion. They're on a different wavelength. So the Chinese need to move very slowly in relationship to it. In my view, 50 years is not long enough to shift the norms and values of Hong Kong society. It'll take a lot longer than that. The Chinese have made two bad mistakes in Hong Kong, in my view. One is introducing the security law bill in 2003 and the extradition bill this year. Why? Because a lot of people, it worried them. They thought, you know, because They don't trust China. This is not new. This goes back a very long time. So by pushing the boat out too far, they got this reaction. Mm-hmm. But I think it's very important to distinguish between these young demonstrators. Very hard mm-hmm. line. I mean, you know, there aren't many people in the world that would be calling for Trump, you know, supporting Trump in these days.
Okay.
But these kids would fly the American flags for Trump.
Now, you talk about the distrust with China. Yes, fairly, there's suspicion against China. And China's been called a bully, okay, by many critics all over the world. You've read many articles that how do you treat a bully, essentially, when you're a small country? And many say the Philippines could have behaved like Vietnam. Vietnam's a small country, but it would not allow Chinese incursions on any point. They asked the oil rig to get out of an area in the South China Sea that they were debating on, and they did it. You've seen Vietnamese protest when China behaves in a way that they felt was an affront to their sovereignty. Isn't this the way to treat China? It seems China responds to that.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting point. I don't think it's correct to call China a bully. I mean, what is true is China's very large and very powerful. So even in a country like the Philippines with nearly 100 million people, or Vietnam, the same kind of population, China is disproportionately strong. And basically, apart from India, every other country in the world can fear the size of China. It just seems so big. And I think that is... That we've got to learn to live with this and know how to handle it, you know. Yeah. And sometimes, yes, I agree with you. You have to push back. You have to find the ways to push back. You have to be able to understand how pushing back fits in with your broader strategy of your relationship with China. So sometimes you won't want to do it, but sometimes you perhaps do want to do it. Yeah. Why not?
Because the other issue that perhaps you can address is, if there's nothing to fear with China, no other claimant country in the South China Sea behaves the way China has. No other claimant country has reclaimed Philippine Islands. None. Yeah. No other country has built from the reefs in our exclusive economic zone. No other country has prevented fishermen from fishing in Scarborough Shoal. No other country, for example, has even militarized areas that's in the exclusive economic zone of another country. So this is what countries fear China can become, as it's already showing what it is as a superpower, as a possible superpower. Yeah.
Well, I don't think... Well, I don't know how much I go along with the term militarization, but let's go along with the term militarization. I don't think ever that has actually been directed primarily at ASEAN countries. Okay. That is to do with the United States. That is because the United States has the 7th Fleet in the South China Sea. What is it doing in the South? I mean, it's serious about it. What's it doing so far away from the United States? It's a presumption that America has the right to go anywhere. Freedom of navigation is not freedom of navigation for cargo. There's no way the Chinese are going to do that, because it would be cutting their nose to spite their face, because when it comes to cargo trade, China is the most affected negatively about anything like that. Yeah. And likewise, you know, the Americans have pushed right up to the economic zone of of southern China and so on, and is constantly flying, and all sorts of violations and so on have taken place all the time. And China has had no power to deal with that. It's had to put up with it. But it is a fiercely, you know, it's a fiercely proud country, China is, which has been humiliated for a very long time. So it has strong feelings, like the Philippines would have strong feelings.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we don't have enough time.
Oh, no, I know, right? Stop. Now, how can you stop now?
Yeah, I know. I feel exactly the same way.
We've only just got going.
Exactly. Now, but you've been invited to talk again, to speak. You'll be speaking at the Chamber of Mines tomorrow. It's at the Sofitel. And essentially, what is the heart of your talk? I mean, yes, of course, it's going to be about the book, right? And you're writing another book still related to China. But what would you want, essentially, Filipinos to come away from your talk?
I think to understand the way the world's moving, understand why the Philippines needs to engage positively with that. In other words, first and foremost, in its relationship with China, to be open-minded, to be willing to learn.
Do you feel Filipinos, this is interesting, aren't open-minded as we should be as a race when it comes to China, even if
No.
there are many Chinese Filipinos in the country?
No, at the moment, definitely not. But for totally understandable reasons. That's not really a criticism of Filipinos in any way whatsoever. But if you've been colonized by the Spanish, colonized by the Americans, and been a neo-colony in some ways of the United States since independence, you have America's seeped into your bones.
Yeah.
So you can't pretend that's not true. It's everyone. I mean, if
Yeah.
I lived here, I'd be exactly the same.
Yeah.
But you got to face the fact that we are living through probably the greatest change in human history for at least 200 years, if not longer, which is the decline of the United States and the rise of your neighbor, China, about which you know very little, and you need to know a lot.
All right.
And don't be frightened, because, you know, Philippines can develop a very good relationship with China. And here, I applaud what Duterte's done.
All right, on that note, Martin, Jacques, what a pleasure. And I have to say, I wish we had more time. And I think the president should meet you. Thank you for watching. For more videos, subscribe to the official ANC YouTube channel and click the I button.